Hello, I am Cody Ellingham, and this is the Transformation of Value podcast. Today I talk with Ben Jarvie. Ben is a Bitcoiner working for Amber App, a Bitcoin-only exchange, but he's also a writer. In this episode, we talk about a piece that Ben wrote for Bitcoin magazine titled New Zealand's Past, Pūtea and Future, CBDC versus Bitcoin. In this article, Ben illustrates a fascinating perspective on the contentious relationship between state and centralised money and the Māori people of New Zealand. The very existence of a singular, undemocratic Reserve Bank of New Zealand goes against the principles laid out in the Treaty of Waitangi for self-determination, though this is conveniently ignored to instead focus on a seemingly unending culture war that sees the Reserve Bank co-opting Māori imagery and symbols of guardianship, whilst simultaneously engineering a recession. More broadly, the article outlines how New Zealand has always been at the mercy of overseas banks and the monetary policy of the Crown, and we are still paying for this today. Ben and I explore various avenues of discussion here, and we arrive at a place that sees Bitcoin really show itself as an opportunity for the empowerment and self-sovereignty of not only Māori communities, but all of New Zealand. If you want to get in touch with me, please send an email to hello@thetransformationofvalue.com and I will get back to you. I do hope you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to support the show, please consider streaming some Satoshis via your favourite podcasting 2.0 platform such as Fountain or Breeze. Otherwise, on to the show. Oh yeah, so how long have you been over in the US for?
Been there for about 3 years now.
Yeah, you enjoying it?
Loving it, eh?
Yeah. Where are you originally from?
From Dunedin.
Oh, no way. So you're
Yeah.
from down south, and you were in Dunedin and then you just left, or did you spend a bit of time anywhere else in New Zealand?
Been a bit nomadic, so a lot of time around Australia, Caribbean, Fiji, and New Zealand and stuff, just kind of bouncing around.
Yeah.
And then met a certain someone, so it's like time to settle down a bit.
Yeah, I know that feeling. I mean, I'm from Hastings originally, and it was like, it's a bit smaller than Dunedin, but you can you either get out or you stay. And I was one of the ones who got out. And so I went on this whole journey and that, but you often come back home, or for me, I come back home and I think, oh man, I could have stayed here, and I could have had a life here, but the horizons were so narrow,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just like, there's so much to explore, so much to see, so much to experience that I felt it was just so limited to being like dirty old Dunners for, a grey, miserable 8 months of the year.
Yeah. I mean, I'm in Wellington at the moment, and it's a little bit like that. It's like it's a city, but it's not quite all the way there. I left Hastings and moved actually to Japan when I was like 20, 21.
Oh, sweet.
And that really was quite life-changing, going from, the biggest, even Auckland in New Zealand is our biggest city, but it's still kind of a small place. You can kind of walk, the CBD and see everything. And then you go to a big mega city like Tokyo and you just see everything. You think, man, this is mind-blowing. To kind of experience that scale, I imagine the US would be a bit similar as well.
Yeah, it is for sure. But I try to avoid cities and very dense populated areas. I just find that it's like a concrete jungle that I don't very much align with, I guess.
Oh, really? So you don't really like that side of urban city living? You prefer the countryside a bit more?
Yeah, for sure. Out with nature a bit more, and you get to go around to farmers markets and go meet your rancher because they only live 10 minutes away, and see how the food's raised and everything. I don't know. It's just more my style.
I got a family friend actually who's from Wisconsin, and I know hunting and that sort of thing, hunting and fishing are quite big over there. And it's quite an outdoors state. And I appreciate that. I think there's something. I mean, this family friend, he actually moved to Napier, so he's an American originally, but it's like someone who can understand that can really appreciate it in New Zealand as well. You've got the kawekas, the rohinis, all of that just there on your doorstep, and that lifestyle that you get in New Zealand is I mean, it's quite wonderful. But the flip side of that is it is a small country, and we do have a lot of challenges here economically, in terms of infrastructure, all of that stuff, which you're no doubt familiar with. But look, what I wanted to talk to you today about is a piece that you wrote a couple of years ago for Bitcoin magazine. So New Zealand's past, Pūtea and future with CBDCs versus Bitcoin. really interested to know sort of how you came to write this piece, what your sort of motivations were, and sort of where it all emerged from, if that's okay, please.
Yeah, sure. So I guess it kind of started with my childhood, like being brought up with this dichotomy of cultural values. So my dad was Pākehā, he was a cop and private investigator, and then my mum was Māori, from Waitaha tribe, and she got a PhD in Indigenous Studies and Peace Treaties. So there was a very big difference in like how they both viewed the world. And so it kind of got me asking this question, of like, how did we get to this point in time, and like researching our history. And so then you kind of, your heart sort of aches because you see like what colonialism has as an impact, right? And you see all the land loss, the slavery, and all the suffering from that, and then the conformity and complicity for the new sort of structure. And then like it's really interesting because you'll see like where it lapsed in the past and where it failed. So you can see that in New Zealand land wars. You can see that in the colonial bank issue. When they first tried to monopolize the money, it ultimately failed because of the lack of confidence. And so then it gets you asking this question of like, especially in regards to Māoridom, the tino rangatiratanga, where it's like self-sovereignty, right? And, what does consent mean? If you can't say no, what does that mean for Māori? And then also from the financial aspect, if the money is monopolized and debased in the name of stability, is that violating the Treaty of Waitangi? And like, do you know what I mean? Like there's this rule set between Māori and the rest of the state, or New Zealand in general, where they never ceded sovereignty. They were supposed to be self-determining under the Treaty of Waitangi. That's what kawanatanga mean. And so then trying to look at it from like understanding its past, trying to extrapolate that outward and sort of have some sort of future projection, when the world is largely going down that technological social credit system route through central bank digital currencies. And so I just started mapping out who some of those key figures are, and started analyzing the reports that the Reserve Bank and stuff are putting out there. And then just tried to piece all of that together, because I see it as this binary outcome, in the sense that, people will always tend to use the best money available, unless by force, which is why you have, fiat in the first place. And so the inevitable conclusion of fiat, though, is the central bank digital currencies, or bust, is the way I sort of see it based on the data that I present in there.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. I mean, I guess a little bit of my whakapapa as well. Like my family a little bit further up the tree, though, are also in that interesting relationship, which I think is, very New Zealand, which is one of my ancestors came over with the British Army, and married into, had a Maori wife, and so it was the beginning of my bicultural connection with New Zealand. And it's been interesting coming back, I was living overseas and coming back and kind of visiting that Tūranga Waiwai and that place of standing in my my hometown, and kind of looking at the story, because it was an interesting relationship, because it was not an iwi relationship. Like they sort of left, and she took took on the customs of what he was doing. So they left the Taranaki region and moved to Hawke's Bay, and basically left that behind, and started a blacksmith shop and a hotel and a few other things in Hawke's Bay. And understanding that connection, there's something quite interesting, because it, the media would have you believe that it's this kind of cultural war, that it's this black and white, that it's this very easily identifiable thing. But for both you and me, for yourself a little bit closer to the present, but for myself historically, I mean, we are part of this connected, this marriage of cultures, and it's a beautiful thing. And I think, inspecting what that means, and what it means for New Zealand today, I think is really
Yeah.
important. And certainly when it comes to the money, and you sort of see that even for my ancestors on the British side, they were also colonized, in the
Yeah,
sense
yeah.
that, none of us gained. So I think there's a certain dialogue that it's somehow the fault of the state today, or that it's the
Yeah.
fault of Pākehā or something like that. White people basically, like, there's this narrative that that's the problem, but actually I think if you run it back, it's the power structures, right? And if you really want to find some responsibility, it lies with the crown, which is on the other side of the world. But certainly it's the power structures, and I think the process of colonization meant many things for many different people, but the self-sovereignty of New Zealand and New Zealanders, whoever you might be, certainly being infringed by these centralized structures, which are basically diluting the money supply. So it's an interesting dialogue, and I think it is important to have these conversations.
Yeah, it is an interesting kaupapa. It yeah, and you're quite right in the sense that the state tries to fan the flames of these culture wars or gender wars or what have you, when in reality it's like they're expropriating time essentially from everyone when they dilute the monetary currency. And but the problem is that historically, with like the land repossessions, and then like the understanding of, I don't know if you're familiar with the Austrian business cycle theory, where it's like that boom and bust. Like they knew that system quite well, and that's how they managed to actually take a lot of land from Māori as well. And then also those like closest to the monetary spigot, obviously initially a Pākehā, and it's sort of like you get a more initial purchasing power, and then as you spend that money, the economy starts to adjust for inflation, so until it trickles down. So that on top of the land reposition, and when you take into consideration the fact that the money being debased and monopolized in the name of stability led to the financialization of certain assets, for example, like housing, right? So those things are always sort of going up in value in the long-term scheme of things, land and housing. And that's because inversely, the purchasing power of the dollar is going down. And so what happens is they come in, and by they, I mean like the crown, right? And so I don't hold any hostility towards Pākehā, because how can I? I'm like one of the widest people around.
Yeah.
But like what ended up happening is they instill the system. So because the Māori introduced trench warfare and were actually quite competent warriors, even against muskets and what have you, they had the Treaty of Waitangi. That was never upheld. Instead, they had a system where they monopolized the money. And as soon as you've monopolized the money, it's like the monopoly on education, the monopoly on media and communication, the monopoly on basically everything is downstream of that, because you can finance what you want at the future generation's expense in terms of like the national debt. So it is this weird sort of dynamic where when I say they, I refer to the crown, I refer to statists, I refer to people who are proponents of that centralized system which disregards consent at a fundamental level.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing I remember reading, I think it was in the Oxford History of New Zealand, reading about some of the in the Wairarapa, the Māori there were really interested in actually leasing their land out, and they really didn't want to sell. And there was a challenge there where basically the state said, look, you have to sell it to us. We're not going to let you lease it out to private people. And so there was these moments, because I think there was a certain sophistication, and very quickly the Māori learned how the system worked. And, they were like, well, we're not going to sell, we're going to lease it out. And that, if the centralizing powers said, no way, you have to sell it to us, or we're not going to let you do that. And there's a lot of examples of that historically where confiscations, or even just through legal means, they were basically put into a corner and forced to relinquish that land. And it was because it was such a recent thing, the if you look at, say, the development of economies and how land gains value as work is done upon it and things like that, usually that's, ancient history, or it's so far away that we don't have any records of it. But because this is relatively recent, there's written records of the development of land, the improvements of land, that kind of these sort of economic actions that led to making more productive land, these sort of things. There's certainly a lot to consider there,
for sure. And productive for who is probably the better question, right?
Well, there's also, I mean, if you look at sort of some of the externalities of it as well, the burning of forests, there was a certain balance, with things, but this desire, which I often think of, if you sort of conceptualize the materiality of, the raw land, especially up, forested hills, and even where I'm from, there was swamplands, low-lying forests and things like that, which all got taken out and turned into farmland. That extraction, I mean, where did that end up? Where did that value go to? Because you can't really destroy value, right? It's kind of like an energy. It moves around. And I often think, you walk down, you're in the United Kingdom, you're in London, Manchester, Bristol, Plymouth, and you see just the massive architecture, these beautiful facades, these beautiful buildings, and you realize every kauri tree, every piece of burnt forest and farmland that got cut, every forest that got cut down in New Zealand, every farmland that was developed, all of that value materialized in England. It's sort of transported. And even even in Auckland, you've got a couple of nice buildings, you've got a couple of streets, but none of the infrastructure was built here. We still don't even have any very good roads. We've got a railway, but it's pretty bad. Like, I think if you look at the flows of it, none of the value stayed in New Zealand. It was extractive, which is the story of colonialism, right?
Yeah, it is mercantilist in nature. And we see that in multiple places, like in Africa with the franc. I think Gladstein did a good piece on that. Or French Polynesia. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's so many circumstances like that. Or the IMF giving out loans to these quote unquote third world countries, knowing that they'll never repay it. And then they just get to extract resources and land. So it is a tale that's old as time.
Yeah, and it's something interesting I wanted to touch on. So, talking about the Reserve Bank. So the New Zealand Reserve Bank was formed in 1934, and you have got a bit of a timeline in your article here. But yeah, so 1934 established the Reserve Bank, and really its original goal, or original mandate, was to have the sole right to issue notes and coins. And at that time, I believe there was legal convertibility to the British pound. But over time, and in the most recent branding exercise that the Reserve Bank has gone through, they've actually given themselves a Maori name as well. And I'd love to just sort of dive into that, because you do give a breakdown of Pūtea Mātua and what that means. But could you maybe explain sort of how that name is even problematic and what it's supposed to mean?
Sure. So Pūtea was what Māori deemed money, I guess, or a gift. It was kind of synonymous with one another. Te is just so the money, and then Mātua is like a respected elder. So Te Pūtea Mātua is like, and in their words, they either say the prime source of finance, and I think they use it in another way too as well, where it's like the respected financial institution or something along the lines of that. And so, as you said, they initially started out where they were just managing coins and notes, and there was a proxy where you could go back to the British fiat as well, which was kind of backed by gold at the time. And then they were actually the first ones to bring in the 2% inflation target. So again, just exemplifying that once you have that monopolization of money, then that's when those centralizing factors really start to kick in elsewhere. So to use that Māori lexicon and call yourself a respected member of the money, and then to call that even Pūtea in general, is just like, it's such a slap in the face. And we see that by them when they changed on the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Waitangi. They changed the face from King Tawhio to Captain Cook on that day. So there's so many just like backhanded moments in that time. We had the lapse in the colonial bank issued money, and then the land wars, and then they somehow monopolized the money again. Like, how was trust, rebuilt from that? Or even is there today to have the audacity to call yourself like the respected elder of finance when central banking in and of itself is the fifth tenet of the Marxist manifesto, like the Communist Manifesto? It's just like, it's so backward. Up is down, left is right.
It's clown world. And I'll tell you, Ben, I walk past the Reserve Bank every day, so I live up the end of town, and it's really strange for me because my old man, he lives in Pūtea, Central Hawke's Bay. It's very close to the land. A lot of beef and lamb farmers up there. It's very rural. They don't even really have cell phone coverage, and there's sort of the difference between Pūtea, Central Hawke's Bay, Te Oti, these places, and the terrace, the Reserve Bank, the Beehive, and looking at the imagery they're using, because I think they have actually co-opted Tane Mahuta, Mahuta, the grand, the grand kauri tree of the forest, the god of the forest. They've co-opted that image.
And as well as that image, they also refer to themselves as kaitiaki, which is like guardian.
Yeah.
So it is just like,
it's an affinity.
I'm gonna get
scam.
myself wound.
Yeah, no, sorry. I mean, and look, I mean, I absolutely hear you, and I think what I find interesting though is in the affinity scam though, we can find a certain truth, which is that they talk about Tane Mahuta, which is this ancient kauri tree up north, and it grows from the tiniest seed. And it's like, I often think, well, if you flip that and I think about Bitcoin, from the tiniest seed, literally the seed phrase, you can set your children up with a little bit of Bitcoin today. In 100 years and 500 years, who knows what that UTXO is going to be worth. Generational wealth for a very small amount at this point in time.
Especially in contrast to like generational debt. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you were to save, say, $100,000 and you want to hand it down to your children, and in like 50 years they want to use it, what is the purchasing power of that going to be? What is your amount of debt as a citizen? What is the national debt going to be? Do you know what I mean? Like, we've got it all backwards, where it's like those closest in the power structure at the moment, when they create money and loan it out to their friends and stuff first, we're increasing that debt for future generations to pay back. And because the only way to pay it back is to either get external funding into New Zealand to pay that back, because if you want to create more money to pay it back, there's obviously more interest associated with that. So I generally view it as a form of debt slavery, and it's not just for Māori, as you've discussed. And I do view that Bitcoin is the solution, and that seed of life in a sense, in the sense that it's just like that. It's just a truth in the sense that gravity is. It's just like, it's a physical reality, where it's like you're going to have to compete with it, and every point that you try compete, it's only going to highlight the austerity that you've involuntarily imposed. So I look forward to them trying to bring it on, especially where they call themselves Māori deities and expropriate the most from the lower social classes.
Actually, that's a good point. Like, they've co-opted the image of Tane Mahuta, and in fact, what they're implicitly saying, and I literally walk past the steps of this building, what they're saying is that we are gods over you.
Yeah, exactly.
And, that's interesting. I got a quote here from your articles. So you say, Pūtea is gift, right? So I would argue that Pūtea has to be founded by the people operating in a free market. It is contradicting to say that the New Zealand dollar is a gift when it continually loses purchasing power and has to be enforced from legal tender laws so that the Crown can retain a monetary monopoly. And it's very timely because right now in New Zealand, we're going through this, in a way, it's kind of like a secret transition towards digital money and CBDCs, which is not getting any media coverage. And certainly myself and other Bitcoin and Bitcoin friends that I've been talking with, following this very closely and making submissions. There is just closed on Monday submissions on the Reserve Bank's proposal for the future of private money. I wrote my piece and had my say there, but having met these people, I was at an event and I was having a chat with some of these people, and I realized just how thin the facade is. They really are trying to hold on to something. They call themselves a value anchor. They're really trying to justify their existence. And I feel like in a roundabout way, it's like the Bitcoin's beating them already. They just don't know it yet.
Yeah. Well, I think they kind of do know it, because in order for them to sort of keep relevance, which is required to keep confidence, keep the monopoly, they need to show that they're innovative and that they're competing and that they're doing what's best for the people. But that's inherently contradictive of what that whole structure stands for, which is expropriation and involuntary contracts. So that's why you see this whole crypto, not Bitcoin, or blockchain, not Bitcoin. And you saw, the guy up in Auckland, and he was creating private blockchain enterprises. I forget his name. But at the same time, he's working with Mitchell Pham, who is this Asian man who started the Digital Council of Aotearoa. And he's talking about a social credit system, like identity verification in the digital age and central bank digital currencies. And it's just so funny, because not only can we point out exactly who these people are and ostracize them for promoting such Malthusian systems, but we can also be like, this is, and by this I mean Bitcoin, this is our only peaceful way out of this. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's either vote with your money or vote with your feet, because you cannot sustain any confrontation with the monopoly on money, violence, and law, because it will be a war of attrition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is interesting. So I was actually at a Binance event that I went to sort of find if I could find any other Bitcoiners. And I was really curious to see what they were up to. I was very skeptical of Binance, obviously, but I went to this event, and it was held across the road from the Reserve Bank up on next to the Beehive. So basically, for anyone listening, in the heart of New Zealand's political district, this Binance event, and they've just become registered as, I think, the largest exchange that has a presence in New Zealand. And what I found really quite concerning was that the content of their presentation at that time, and there were two senior Reserve Bank people there that I had to talk with. The content of their presentation was clearly aimed at basically greasing the wheels for having Binance provide some of this infrastructure. And it really, to me, it felt like it was almost like this kind of neo-colonialism, right? You're going to get this Chinese-American overseas entity, basically, because there's no capability in New Zealand. In fact, most people don't know this, but our money isn't even printed in New Zealand. Our notes are made in Canada, like our physical, notes. But there was this idea that, we don't even have the infrastructure here to actually build the CBDC that they're trying to sell. And so they're going to get some foreign entity to do it. And it's like we're living version 2.0 of this colonial dream, this colonial nightmare, where a company like Binance, potentially, which is what it felt like to me, kind of analyzing the situation, that the Reserve Bank are there, they're scoping them out. I mean, because who are you going to get to build this thing out?
Yeah.
And if Binance do it, I mean, if you look at their history and the slideshow that they went through was, it was all about how compliant they are, how much law enforcement workshops they've been doing, how many, those sort of figures and facts, which I'm like, man, as a consumer, that doesn't really interest me, but I could see why the government would, or the Reserve Bank would want to be seeing those kind of figures.
Yeah. It's one of those ordeals where it's like, fiat shares the same fate as crypto does, and the best that they can hope for is to be taken over and commandeered into a CBDC.
Yeah.
Because otherwise they cannot compete. And that bifurcation of multiple of them doesn't make any sense because the monopolies tend to only want one because it's easier to manage.
They're feigning it. They're pretending that they want to have a discourse about a plurality of private money and private innovation and money, but I absolutely agree with you. They're not going to let that happen. And when I talked to one of these, so I was at this event and I was talking to this Reserve Bank senior policy guy, and I was like, "So what are you doing?" And he's straight up said to me, "We're working on a CBDC," and that really concerned me because I was like, "Yeah, I kind of knew that was a thing, that was a tranche of work that you guys were working through, but to come out with that straight away, was kind of quite, I wouldn't say shocking because I kind of expected it, but they're working and everything else is a bit of a smokescreen and they're like, they're open for proposals. They want to have public feedback and all of that, but they're really just going to bin it. They don't care what we have to say.
Exactly. They never have.
And again, that sort of reiterated for me that there's stuff going on behind closed doors that, and the Reserve Bank is problematic, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but as a crown, it is a crown entity, so it's not government, it's not democratic in that sense. It's not like our MPs. Who do you even talk to? Do they have a process to even engage properly? Because I don't think there's any accountability. Like they're actually the ones doing all of this stuff, but they're unelected.
I have previously interviewed like the head policy advisor from the NZ Treasury. I have interviewed ex-central bankers from the RBNZ. I've interviewed economists. He's now the head economist of ANZ. But what you find is that a lot of these interviews will never get allowed to see the light of day, because once you start asking some meaningful questions, then they're not so happy for you to share and distribute that content. And so you're quite right. What I found was it did violate the treaty 100%. Just nothing's ever going to happen about it. You're right that you can't vote on monetary policy. In fact, there's very little meaningful subjects that you can vote on. And then the only real thing you can do is sort of vote with your money and your feet. But that's kind of the beauty of this age, in the sense that if you've read the book, The Sovereign Individual, which I think every sort of Bitcoiner has, you understand that thesis where it's like, it's no longer just subjects, quote unquote, or citizens protesting by just like being in the streets. It's like, no, you can move to a jurisdiction that's better for tax purposes if it has some at all. Some don't. You can opt out with Bitcoin, and it's no longer just like the people versus the state, because it's not just like a national conflict. It's an international thing. So every time you're choosing to use and save in Bitcoin, you're not only building the wealth of everyone else who wants to have that voluntary optionality to sort of divert from that social credit system. You're building their wealth and power to fight that system, but at the same time, you're taking power away from that involuntary debt slavery system. And so enough people do that en masse, and then you have, cascading liquidations and the dominoes start falling. And that's all that's needed. It just needed that, 1 to 10% of people, the intolerant minority, the remnant, and that'll make all the world's difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, looking at, the Reserve Bank, again, there's a certain hubris to them, in the way they operate. I felt that, as I said, I met with this Reserve Bank senior policy guy at this shitcoin event, and I was like, okay, he's like, well, who are you affiliated with? And I was like, well, I'm a Bitcoiner, I'm affiliated with myself. And it's like they fail, or maybe they struggle to conceptualize that as a sovereign individual. I'm not here with a company. I have a job. I do commercial work, but I'm not here through that. I'm here for myself, and in a way, that's why you can have companies emerge that are shilling their crypto or whatever, and they seem, for a short while at least, they seem to get the kind of the limelight, but in the background, Bitcoin sort of just keeps on going. and it keeps on getting just a footnote reference in all of their media, all of their discussions. It's all about stable coins, all about the shit coins, the cryptos, Bitcoin's just this little thing down the bottom, but it just keeps on going. And by providing an alternative, that optionality, I think that's really the power here, is that suddenly we've got two paths that we can take. And
yes,
that, I think, looping back into the Māori and how that can work, seeing the way communities operate, and how decentralized money is actually a very I think applicable concept for Māori. And if you look at communities, as I said, my dad lives out Parongaho. It's it's a lot of beef and lamb, a lot of firewood, pine, that sort of thing. Pine plantations and all of that. But it's a very local community. And I can see something like Bitcoin existing as a very useful medium in a community like that, where outside money doesn't even really need to be used. It can just be peer to peer. But what's your thoughts on Maori communities, iwi, adopting Bitcoin and using it?
Sure. I think to begin with, as a premise, that there's definitely a lot of lessons that we should have learned from King Tawhio. He went to the Queen to petition to set up his own bank. He got granted those rights. He set up a full reserve bank, which is great, but it can't compete with fractional reserve in the long run, because the fractional reserve bank can steal wealth from all of its users to sort of entice further users and grow that Ponzi at the expense of customers for the other full reserve bank, which needs to charge more in regards to its services because it has to keep all of its reserves. It doesn't get to spend its users' funds. So you can't compete with the full reserve system. You can't go back to gold. And the reason why is it's expensive to store, to send, and to verify its authenticity when we see $1 billion of tungsten covered gold. Tungsten covered in gold. And so going back to that precious metal, that physicality led to centralization because it needed some sort of secondary medium, like the paper or coins, which are divisible, easy to send, easy to verify. So going back to that is it's literally insanity, because you're going back to a system that failed and you know it. The alternative is barter, but barter doesn't give you savings, the ability to interact with wider communities or international communities. It means that you're stuck in that localist sort of area, which is fine, but then you don't get things like the specialization and division of labor. You don't get price signals and all of the time and efficiency that comes from money as a system to overcome the double coincidence of wants. So you need a money to sort of persist and exist, because otherwise it's a war of attrition against a very powerful enemy, because they have monopolies on everything. And so you need some sort of way to not only exist, but to actually grow in terms of purchasing power, because at the end of the day, that's how you all manage to have, a good ho order. Money touches every aspect of that. Your whare, is it cold? Is it damp? Do you get to sleep in it well? Your food, the quality of food, your quality of education. You need Pūtea, not fiat, in order to sustain generational wealth and health. And so what I think in regards to Māori adopting it is that they're very technologically averse, which I understand, because, historically speaking, that's led to us basically losing everything. So I understand the adversity to it, but it's one of those truths that will permeate no matter what. So I guess they'll get the price that they deserve. Whereas, if it's a binary outcome between CBDC and Bitcoin, as we've stated, and they take too long to sort of understand the dynamics at play, then it'll be at a higher price and it'll come at the loss of that purchasing power. So I've had a few consultations just trying to explain the basic concepts. But it's no easy feat, because you have to explain, like, why is money important? What is money? Why is Bitcoin important? What is Bitcoin? Like, that's a solid 3 to 4 hour discussion to give like the light overview. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Especially to a crowd that's technologically averse. So it's definitely a difficult conversation to have. But I think the young Māori sort of see, what's up. They're more technologically adept. They are more familiar with, social media and how things can go viral. They're more familiar with technology in general. So I think it'll just be a thing where it's like the younger generations, it's our responsibility to take accountability for the system, to take responsibility for it, because if we don't, no one else will. And to sort of have those meaningful conversations. Because I don't know about you, but my household on my dad's side, it was always very like shallow conversations, like, hey, how are you? Good. How are you? And it's like you didn't really talk about anything emotionally. And then on my mum's side, you could talk about whatever you wanted on the Māori side. I don't know if that's a cultural thing, a gender thing. But if we don't start having those more meaningful conversations, you're going to wake up and it's like, oh, you have to show your identity to get in the supermarket. Oh, you've had too much steak this week. It's only crickets for the rest of the week. And
Yeah.
it will get that bad. Oh, you want to protest? Oh, that's your transport shut down for the week and your money turned off for the week. It will be that on and off switch for it. And if we don't start waking up to that now, I really fear for, Māori and all of New Zealand. I really fear for that future.
Absolutely. And I think this is where my journey really came in as well with Bitcoiners over the last few years. I mean, you've been in the United States, but myself being back in New Zealand, I left Asia where I was, working and living, came back to New Zealand. I thought, oh, this is great. The government don't really have much to do with me here, because they're kind of in your face in where I was in Japan and China. They kind of they get in the way. And I was like, oh, New Zealand's great. It's easy. But then that all changed pretty quickly. And I was very shocked with what happened coming back with the lockdowns and everything. And I was like, man, this is not what I signed up for. And in a way, New Zealand was more susceptible to it because we're politically naive. New Zealand's never had a real dictator. We've never had anything like that. So it's kind of like we were just taken for a full ride. And at the same time, all of this other stuff was pushed through. And it's really quite disturbing. And we're in a bit of a calm at the moment where it's like, well, there's an election coming up and people are sort of sitting on their hands. But I feel like I absolutely agree with you. You're going to have to show your papers. And this is where for Maori as well, where I grew up in Hawke's Bay, it's a very Maori area. And I realized there's a lot of latent potential, but it was almost through the actions of the state, this kind of promotion of this kind of dependence on the state as well in a lot of areas, which is quite destructive. And if I contrast sort of where I grew up to where my dad lives now, which is very self-sovereign. So, Flaxmere, Hastings, that area, it's this very dependent kind of a setup. Whereas you go to Parongo and it's very self-sovereign. Everyone kind of looks after themselves. There's a really nice community out there. And that, for me, that's like the real community, the real kind of Maori culture, which is that kind of community building, familial, generational connections. It's just down the road from the longest place name in Central Hawke's Bay, which is like, they've been on that land for a long time. And if you see the generations, you understand that there's already that generational kind of low time preference, which really aligns with Bitcoin thinking. But I agree the technology of it is perhaps a little bit hard to communicate, and also the ideology of fiat and just the system and kind of this is the opportunity to break out of that cycle. And trying to communicate that is a challenge, and it requires hours and it requires discourse. But I think one opportunity is that people who are closer to the land, and I've really found this, I don't know about you, but people who are closer to the land tend to understand Bitcoin a lot easier than people in the city. So technology people, engineers, software engineers, people like that, interestingly enough, are almost the ones who are less likely to get it. Whereas you talk, and you know what I mean? And I talk to farmers, I talk to people out in the countryside, and they're like, money should be real. And they don't mean digital versus physical. They mean it shouldn't be this abstraction of the government. It should be real.
Yes.
You get that, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And just to touch on a few points there, because there's a little bit to unpack. Some of those sweeping rules when it came in for COVID and stuff like that, it was like the lockdowns, they tried to mandate stuff. And then at the same time, though, there was backdoor handshakes between like Jacinda and the World Economic Forum. I posted a piece about her too, because she was a young global leader. She signed New Zealand up for the test pilot for AI governance, which is just another term synonymous with the social credit system. And then you have people like David Seymour, who was also pro-vax mandate. The opposition in the National Party was also pro it. So you have this like false dichotomy of actually being able to vote your way out of tyranny. And it's just never been the case in all of history that has ever been possible. And when you say people who are more technologically familiar get stuck into the crypto side of things, yeah, they do, because they're close to those city centers generally. As you said, they are used to like a good pay. And so they're not used to like, oh, my dollar's losing purchasing power. No, it's like, so they view it from a different lens. It's just like people in Argentina or Lebanon or Venezuela, they view Bitcoin completely different than anyone in America would, because they, might wake up one day like Lebanon did recently, and they lose 90% of their wealth overnight just because they decided to digitally print more. So there's definitely some pockets of people who are more staunch and sort of grok it quite quickly. I guess the only way to sort of to do that though is grassroots, in the sense that you've probably seen recently the beef initiative, the Australian beef initiative and stuff like that, where it's like shake your rancher's hand, pay them proper money. And so it's like through this grassroots that we're all going to start building this circular economy. And so like that's how we have to go about it. But these farmers, as much as they get it, it's not simple in the sense that, oh, I'll turn up and here's your gold, and then I'll just grab my beef and I'm on my way. It's like, no, you got to have a hardware wallet. You got to have a node. Do you know what I mean? Like, you don't have to have it all straight away, but it's definitely a lot of growth in order to get there. And then when people say in response to that, though, like, oh, they'll never understand that. It's like, it's really as easy as writing down 24 words and just familiarizing yourself with the software. The alternative is trusting the central bank not to debase the currency, trusting the commercial banks not to lend out waves of credit with barely a fraction in reserve, and to protect your identity, and then trusting those three and the payment processes not to censor your transactions due to what have it, whether it's a political view or something along the lines where you posted something on social media that you probably shouldn't have. Yeah. And so it's just about like, the more that the state pushes and tries to stay relevant and tries to become authoritarian, the more appealing the alternative becomes. The more people that head that way, the more value gets drained from the state, more value goes to the people. It's just like, I do view it as that sort of inevitability. Even though there are definitely things that can go wrong at this point, it's just like, you see how hard they're fighting against it. It really seems like a Hail Mary to try and introduce this CBDC system before it's too late. Yeah. But I think it's already too late.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I think the other trend which I've really felt over these last few years is the centralization of government and local government in New Zealand. And so, I mean, really, Three Waters, a few other things which are, controversial depending on who you talk to, but certainly the high level political take is that it's removing power from local government and councils, which are already pretty powerless. They can set the rates and things like that, but it's all moving to Wellington, the capital. Yeah. And this concerns me because, I look around Wellington, I don't see any cows, I don't see any orchards, I don't see any farmland. These guys don't understand that New Zealand's economy is based on, agriculture, and that, you go out to Parongo, you go out to, you go up north, you go to the Waikato, and you see this farmland, and you see that this is what New Zealand, is. This is what we are, and not it's a small percentage of people working on the land, but it's our country. And that rural urban divide, where you've got farmers who are being taxed, and you've got emissions trading schemes stuff, all of this stuff which is just so much compliance. And obviously there is an environmental approach, and it needs to be a negotiation and a discourse, but a lot of it feels like it's kind of top down, and it can be very destructive because you push a farmer enough, and they plant pine trees instead of growing food, that's not going to feed anybody.
Yeah,
And there's these sorts of things which I do find a bit concerning, and it feels like it's a global thing. It's like
for sure it
we're not
is.
we're not the only ones.
Yeah, you can see that as well, with the European Central Bank really struggling recently, and now they're like, climate change is our biggest issue. It's like, oh, how many trillions you're gonna have to print for that? Do you know what I mean? And then it's
Yeah.
just like, if you go down that rabbit hole, it's just like they're using skewed metrics to frame certain things so that they can centralize power further. And Māori have been weaponizing that against themselves in the sense that one tribe will weaponize the state so that they can get more land and territory, like Ngāi Tahu. I'll name names. And then, I've worked for Māori charities as well. And then they start talking about ESG and all of that to try and get funding from the state to build X, Y, and Z. And it's just like, you don't quite grok it, but you are weaponizing the state against your people. Yeah, you might get a papakaiing or something out of it, right? But this is going to have long lasting effects that are going to really influence your mokapuna's ability to have a meaningful existence.
Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of Ngāi Tahu, which effectively are the iwi for the South Island, right? They are basically, they are a corporation. They've got operations. They are a mini state in that sense. They don't have full powers, but they're very professionally, corporately run. And I often think, again, as I said with my whakapapa, my Maori ancestry is something that I'm really interested in. I've been learning a lot about lately. But I mean, we don't really even have an iwi affiliation, so I don't even fit into that box. I kind of can, but it's not a connection that can be connected to an entity like Ngāi Tahu, where it's like, okay, well, I'm going to buy in and get these shares of this thing. It's that almost feels like it's a very statist corporate approach. Whereas what I'm interested in is the connection to the land and a little bit of more of the spiritual side and that sort of thing. And for me, and family, right, and my immediate family and extended family, and for me, that's the connection that I've become very interested in, and the ancestral piece. But when you look at it as just another corporatization of state power and centralization, and as you say, planting pine forests and doing ESG and having strategies and all this stuff, I don't know, it's like a mutation of that centralized kind of colonial system in a way. It's like I don't know, you know what I mean?
It is, yeah, because ESG, the environmental societal sort of impact, it's like that's the state's policy. They have set that agenda. You catering to that, thinking that you're going to get the bigger end of the stick, is naive. Like, look at your history. That has never been the case where Māori have come off well from interacting with the state in some sort of legal capacity. It has always ended in expropriation of wealth or land. And so it's just like, it's just working with the state, working with the monopoly to try and increase your share of the pie is such a short-sighted attempt to sort of make meaning of your life, and have that purpose. Like, you really want that to be your legacy, is aiding the state to take away iwi land from some other iwi or to take away wealth from someone else. And then what are they doing with all of that wealth too? Have you looked at like the national foreign liabilities and where all that money actually flows to? It's just like, that's what you're aiding there, is that extended mercantilism. It hasn't gone away.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, man. But look, I think sort of closing up, I really, as I said, I really enjoyed reading your article. I think it's a great perspective, looking at how Bitcoin can be considered through this Maori sovereignty, self-sovereignty lens in New Zealand, and how it can provide something that's aspirational and hopeful, given that, in a lot of cases, Maori communities are ones who are at most disadvantaged by the central bank system and the debt, the debt creation, the debt system. I only have to go back to my hometown and see the DTS, where they rent out whiteware and TVs for, however many dollars a week. And I think, man, this is exploitative indentured servitude, where you have to rent out a washing machine or a television. And I don't see that in central Wellington. I don't see that in Queen Street. I see that in Hastings. I see that in Waipukaro, these places. And I think that stuff, if we can provide the information, have the conversations, have the hui about what the alternatives look like, maybe we can see some really great initiatives that are aspirational for Maori, but for everyone, basically. And as a small country, I mean, the Reserve Bank is just up the road. It's a small building. There's only, it's not untouchable in the sense that I think if enough Kiwis stood up and said, hey, we're actually just going to use this other thing. I mean, they can't do much about it already, but they definitely couldn't do much if everyone said they're going to change, and they change. So yeah, I mean, for me, it feels hopeful.
Oh, it's definitely hopeful. I feel that as well. I feel that part of the sort of Bitcoin hero's journey, if you will, is sort of realizing the wasteland that fiat is. And then you become like this doom and gloom, nihilistic, sort of hedonistic person. Like, they're stealing from you. That consent is disregarded. There's nothing you can do about it. And then you find this like solution. It's like, oh, I can opt out of that. And then all of a sudden you sort of overcome that nihilistic view, and then you become optimistic. You start working on yourself as an individual. You start trying to help others sort of see that orange light as well. And then you return home the hero and get to like share that lesson learned with people so that they can follow those footsteps too. Mm-hmm. And so focusing on like individual prosperity is what makes the collective better.
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. And look, I think it's great stuff. In terms of what you're doing and sort of if people want to learn more, I mean, you said that you've done a few interviews and things like that. Is this something that you're publicly sharing? I mean, where are you at the moment in terms of your work publicly with Bitcoin? Is that something you could talk about?
Sure. I work with the Amber app. So we're a Bitcoin-only exchange, have been since 2017. I stopped writing content from that last piece that we just discussed today. And that's because I wasn't sure if I wanted to be the face or vocal about it, in the sense that there could be some repercussions for it. And now I've started writing content again, which I'm really looking forward to. And I just don't care. I'm just going to speak the truth. And if that makes me a martyr, then so be it. So yeah, I'll be helping out the Amber app, helping other people start the hero's journey and along it. And I'll be pumping out some more content soon.
Yeah. Do you have like a place where people can follow along with that? What's the best way to see when you do push out some work? Where can they find that?
Good question. I don't want to dox my NIM, which is a Twitter handle.
Okay.
But if you go to the Amber app, you join their Telegram community, feel free to reach out and I'll happily respond and help in any way I can.
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. I fully respect your privacy there. All right, man. Well, look, Ben, I really appreciate it. This has been a great conversation, and it's actually one that I would love to dive into these adjacent topics again with you in the future. I really feel like there's a lot here. Myself being really passionate about this, and for what New Zealand can be and what it can do here. I think having thought leaders like yourself, who we can have this conversation with, for me, that's really valuable. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Cody. I definitely don't view myself as a thought leader, but always happy to help, brother.
All right. Thanks, Ben. Kia ora.
Welcome. Kia ora.